This hour, when we are happy to follow through on a frequent guest request from many of you. We have with us this hour Noam Chomsky, a professor of linguistics and philosophy at MIT. He's with us to talk with you about U.S. foreign policy issues and his latest book, Imperial Ambitions, Conversations on the Post-9/11 World. This book contains previously unpublished interviews conducted by radio journalist David Barsamian, in which Mr. Chomsky offers his views on the invasion and occupation of Iraq, the doctrine of preemptive strikes, and the growing threat to international peace posed by the U.S. drive for domination, and more. And you can call in with your own questions. Help me conduct this interview at 1-800-642-1234. 1-800-642-1234, toll free from anywhere. If you're in Madison, 263-1890, 263-1890. Noam Chomsky is with us today just days after he was voted the world's top public intellectual. He won the Prospect Foreign Policy poll. According to The Guardian in London, Chomsky is underwhelmed by this honor, which was determined by more than 20,000 voters from around the world, selecting the winners from a list of 100. Noam Chomsky modestly told The Guardian that the balloting was probably padded by some friends of his. Noam Chomsky joins us by telephone. Good morning.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for being with us, and congratulations anyway on your award.
Okay.
I know many listeners have been among those probably who voted for you for that, and I thought that we would talk a little bit about balloting and maybe padding. What do you think of the reports that we see in the news just these days that the Iraqi constitution election over the weekend is being viewed as being suspicious with high vote totals in some provinces and balloting in some provinces showing nearly 100% approval of the proposed constitution?
Well, I think it would be very unlikely for I have no information, of course, but it would be unlikely for an election in a country that's living in such catastrophic conditions. It would be unlikely for it not to be manipulated in various ways. I don't really think that's the issue, though. I mean, I think an accurate description of it was, in fact, given by the Wall Street Journal a couple of days before the election. They're in favor of it, of course. But their news reporters in Iraq, several of them, wrote that it's what they call a battle of the mosques. During the period of the U.S.-British sanctions, for 10 years, which just devastated the society. One of the consequences was to lead to a religious revival in what had been a rather secular society, with a secular constitution, in fact. But in desperation, people just turned to mosques, whichever ones they were, and that has increased sharply after the invasion. The invasion just had a disastrous effect on the society. It's the veteran correspondent Patrick Coburn, who knows Iraq very well, and incidentally is one of the few journalists who lives outside the green zone, the protected green zone, has said that he thinks it's one of the worst military catastrophes in history, and others agree. And in those conditions, there has been a sharp increase in a commitment to the one institution that people can sort of grab onto, which are the mosques. And in fact, the voting corresponded to that. They voted the way the religious authorities instructed them to, or in the Kurdish areas, the way the political alliance instructed them to. So what you're getting is kind of a census where overwhelmingly the Kurds vote for the political parties, they're allied. The Sunni vote for the one or the other of the religious authorities, and the Shiites, some split, but overwhelmingly follow either Ayatollah Sistani or Muqtada al-Sadr, So it's basically a vote for, it's, I think, what the Wall Street Journal described, essentially a battle of the mosques. How are the religious authorities going to tell people to vote? That's not, it's kind of an election, but not much.
You know, we have full lines, and I think I'm going to let our callers in on this, and I'll ask you some other questions about some current issues as we go along. Here, I believe, is one of the listeners who frequently or has requested you to be with us. Hi, John in Madison.
Yeah, I'd like to see Noam as a permanent host, personally. But anyway, 3 questions. Could you explain the preventive war strategy of the Bush administration now under the National Security Strategy document? Secondly, in your book, you were asked what it would really mean to bring democracy to Iraq, and you analyzed that. I'd like to hear you do that. And also, you mentioned a lot of public opinion polls are not even published because they show that the public is far to the left of both political parties regarding domestic and foreign policy issues. Could you illustrate that? Thank you.
Well, on preventive war, that's just that actually is the right term. I'm glad you used it. It's sometimes called preemptive war, which it isn't. The preventive war strategy is explicit. It was reiterated and strengthened in the latest defense Pentagon program, which was just released a couple of months ago. It states that the U.S. Will use military force to attack and destroy any group, that state, whatever, that the administration regards as potentially a challenge to U.S. Dominance of the world. That essentially is carte blanche to attack anyone you like. That's a good example of, going to your third point, of a position that's sharply opposed by the American population. The population in these essentially unpublished polls, and they're by the leading polling institutions in the world, in fact, and the most respected. The public takes a rather conservative view of the UN Charter, namely, which says that you can use force only under orders of the Security Council, or if a country is in imminent danger of attack. So, for example, if you find Russian planes flying across the Atlantic about to bomb the United States, you could shoot them down and maybe attack their bases. That's the UN Charter, and that's what the public supports. The idea that you can attack anyone you like because you think someday they might be a challenge, that's just outlandish. I mean, it's an announcement that the administration wants to turn the United States into what's sometimes called an outlaw state that pays no attention to international law or international order. It's particularly ironic in this case because the United States was instrumental in forming these doctrines, played a leading role in instituting the UN Charter. It's not the only case of violation, but this is extreme. The second, let me go to the third. The public opinion polls, several major ones have been carried out. Perhaps the most important were the ones released about a month before the November elections. Again, these are the most respected polling institutions in the world. The Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, which regularly monitors attitudes, and the Program on International Policy Attitudes, based at the University of Maryland, which is a very serious polling institution, does in-depth polls. And they do joint projects. And they had a joint release shortly before, about a month before the election. I could go through the details if you want, but what it basically shows is what you said, that the bipartisan consensus, the two political parties, which are not very different, are way to the right of the public on issue after issue, major issues. And that they did another such study shortly after the budget was announced. The federal budget was announced in February. And they did a study which was released early days of maybe March 1st, early days of March, which was dramatic. It showed that public opinion about the budget was virtually a mirror image of what the budget actually is, where the government calls for increase in spending, the public wanted decrease, like military supplementals for Iraq and Afghanistan and so on, where the government wants decrease, the public wants increase, often overwhelmingly. Social spending, support for renewable energy, support for the United Nations, and so on. And the public, again, overwhelmingly wants to rescind the Bush cut tax breaks for people with incomes over $200,000. That's called in the press sacrosanct. Can't do anything with that. Doesn't matter if the public's overwhelmingly opposed. And you can see that in the one example is the Katrina spending. You can't touch the tax cuts for the rich. That's sacrosanct, even though the public's strongly against them. Yeah. But you have to cut social spending, which the public opposes. They want to increase it. Coverage of this apparently was zero. A friend who does media searches could not find a single reference to this in the press. And that's not, these are extreme examples, it's true, but they're not so unusual. And that really tells you something about ourselves. In a democratic society, it's very important for people to know what the public thinks about things. So people don't feel, well, I'm the only person in the world with these crazy ideas. Mm-hmm. And that information is just either doesn't appear at all, as in the budget case, or scarcely appears, as in the case right before the elections. I think maybe 2 newspapers in the country or something like that had news reports, and there were a few scattered op-eds.
And what would it mean to bring democracy to Iraq?
Democracy to Iraq is the third one. First, we should remember, it's another interesting comment on democracy in the United States. The U.S. went to war. The U.S. and Britain went to war because of what Bush, Blair, Powell, and others insistently said was what they called a single question. Will Saddam Hussein give up his weapons of mass destruction? That was hammered home day after day. That's the condition under which the Congress gave a rather weak authorization for the use of force. Within a couple of months, that question was definitively answered. We all know the answer. And instantly, there was a change. Instantly, it turned out that the reason for going to war was not the weapons of mass destruction, but it's what the press calls Bush's messianic mission to bring democracy to Iraq. Well, if that happened in North Korea or something, we'd laugh. Here, in contrast, that was taken very seriously. Now every scholarly article, journals uniformly, intellectuals who write about things, open by saying, by speaking of the president's commitment to bring democracy to Iraq, the Middle East, Mars, whoever it may be. The sole evidence for that is that our leader said so after the reasons for the war collapsed. The evidence against it is just overwhelming. I won't run through it. But there are good reasons. In fact, the elections are a good example. The U.S. bitterly opposed elections in Iraq. It opposed Iraqis writing a constitution. It was compelled to back down because of a real triumph of nonviolent mass resistance. The majority population, the Shiite population, simply resisted, partly at the call of Ayatollah Sistani, but it was a mass resistance, and the U.S. just couldn't face another major insurgency, so it finally agreed to allow some kind of elections and to allow Iraqis to write a constitution where everyone thinks about it, and then, of course, took credit for it. So now that's presented as a major achievement of U.S. democracy promotion. And the same is true of the other examples. If you look, they all fall apart instantly. Nevertheless, this has become a kind of a mantra. You don't challenge it. The scattered questioning, but essentially everyone is supposed to bow down to that, as if we were in North Korea. The leader has spoken. What else is there to say? There are exceptions. One exception is Iraq. So just as the president announced his messianic mission in a very well-reported speech at the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, a Gallup poll was released in which people in Baghdad were asked why they thought the United States invaded. Well, some agreed with near unanimous U.S. commentary, Western commentary, I should say. Some agreed, mainly 1%. 1% said the goal was to bring democracy. 5% said the goal was to help Iraqis. And most of the rest said what everybody in the world assumes, that the goal was to take control of Iraq's immense oil resources and to use a base in Iraq to organize the Middle East region, the oil-producing regions, even more in accord with U.S. wishes. But we're not allowed to say that here. That's called a conspiracy theory or something like that. We're instructed to believe that the U.S. government Bush would have proceeded to, as it's called, liberate Iraq, even if their main product was, let's say, pickles and lettuce. That's the sort of official line. But it's pretty hard to sell that to Iraqis or anybody with their eyes open. Will the U.S. try to bring democracy? It's almost inconceivable. I mean, the Iranian governor, for example, welcomed the elections with an effusive statement about how they favor democracy in Iraq and a sovereign Iraq and so on and so forth. Well, we don't take that very seriously. You never take seriously professions of benign intent by leaders. It's reflexive. They always say that, no matter who they are, Hitler, Stalin, anyone you like. We ask whether it's true. And we ought, if we were living in a functioning democratic society, we would ask whether it's true in the case of our leaders. Well, the evidence is overwhelmingly against it. The sole evidence for it is declarations after the presumed reason, the announced reason, fell apart. But is it even conceivable? I mean, just consider the policies that a democratic sovereign Iraq would be likely to follow. If it would have a Shiite majority, they would surely establish closer relations with Iran. In fact, a large part of the leadership and the military and the militias that control the South were trained and come from Iran, were trained there, fought with Iran in a war, and so on. And they'd rather have friendly relations with their powerful neighbor than hostile ones. In fact, that's already happening. In the southern regions, Shiite regions, relations are strengthening. Surely that's not what the U.S. wants. Furthermore, there is a Shiite population in Saudi Arabia, right across the border. They've been bitterly oppressed by the U.S.-backed tyranny. And there are now stirrings for rights and some degree of autonomy reflecting what's happening in Iraq. And that's likely to increase. So you could, and that happens to be where most of Saudi Arabia's oil is. So you could, I'm sure in Washington, they're trembling about a kind of an ultimate nightmare, a loose Shiite alliance, Iraq, Iran, southern Iraq, Iran, and the oil-producing regions of Saudi Arabia, an alliance which would control most of the world's energy resources, be independent of the United States, tied to Iran.
Professor Chomsky, I need to jump in. We're at a break time. We are talking with Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics and philosophy at MIT, author of numerous political works, including Imperial Ambitions, Conversations on the Post-9/11 World. 1-800-642-1234, 1-800-642-1234, in Madison, 263-1890, 263-1890. And I'm going to ask our listeners who call in to try to limit yourself to one question so we can get to as many callers as possible. I'm Joy Cardin. This is the Ideas Network. Ideas Network. I'm Joy Cardin. Kathleen Dunn is with you between 9 and 11 this morning. And look who's joining Kathleen after 9 o'clock. William Crystal, editor of the Weekly Standard, will be on hand to talk about the anniversary anthology of the Noam Chomsky. And our next caller is Linda in Monroe. Hi, Linda. You're on the air.
Good morning, Joy. It's a pleasure to talk to you, Professor Chomsky.
Thank you.
Now, while our country's going broke, we have corporations with virtually more power and salaries, some over $500 million, making them where they have virtually more power than our government. Now, President Bush, who seems to be lobbying for them by keep saying they need more tax breaks, makes the whole situation even worse by widening the gap between the rich and the poor. You see, he doesn't want to raise the federal income tax, but how are we going to pay for the war? Now, he wants to get the money from Social Security and the FICA tax, and that would be from the poorest people. Now, I believe he's trying to eliminate the Social Security down the road and take care of his rich billionaire friends all at the same time. And what do you think?
I think you're exactly right. I mean, to put it very simply, the policy of the government is to stuff as many dollars as possible into the pockets of very rich people and let the rest somehow take care of themselves, and that includes future generations who, of course, will suffer from this. I mean, it's not only that corporations are, the tax rate is cut way back, and the tax rate for the rich is cut way back, but by now there's a huge tax haven racket whereby corporations are technically based in offshore tax havens and don't pay taxes at all. That black money, as it's sometimes called, is estimated to be just immense. As for Social Security, yeah, you're quite right. In fact, there's not even a question about it. The president has made clear that a high goal is to what's called reform Social Security. Reform is a technical term that means destroy. They don't like Social Security for very good reason. Social Security, first of all, does not help the wealthy. I mean, I'm retired, so I get Social Security, but I've also been a professor for 50 years at a major university, which means I got a big pension and so on. And for me, people like me, toward the top end of the income bracket, Social Security is just icing on the cake. You wouldn't notice it if it disappeared. But for a very large part of the population, probably close to half, they really rely on it. Furthermore, Social Security is a government program, so it's extremely efficient. There are very low administrative costs, so there's nothing in it for the financial institutions, the money managers, and so on. And thirdly, Social Security is based on a principle that is supposed to be driven out of our heads, and that is that we have a community responsibility to care if, say, a disabled widow across town doesn't have food. And we're not allowed to think that. It's drilled into your head that you're supposed to be out for yourself, nobody else. And this idea that we're a community working together to care for one another, that's a very dangerous principle. In order to destroy Social Security, an incredible mythology has been developed, which you can't even, it's hard to even call it deceit, it's just pure lies about a fiscal crisis. I mean, Social Security is probably the healthiest state it's ever been. The famous baby boomers have already been paid for by the payroll tax increase that Greenspan pushed through in 1983. Besides, it's sort of a fake number. We're constantly told that the number of working people, the ratio of working people to retired people is declining, which is, of course, true. But the proportion of, the right number is the proportion of working people to population. Now, the baby boomers were once children, and they had to be taken care of, and they were. You look back in the 60s, school expenditures went way up. Other expenditures for child care went way up. In fact, what's called the dependency ratio, the proportion of working people to population, was at its lowest, according to government statistics, in 1965. It's not expected to reach that for the foreseeable future. Furthermore, it's a much richer society now than then. It'll be even more rich, 20, 30 years from now. That's just normal productivity increase, which means that every worker will be producing more and more wealth. There's no reason why a wealthier society can't take care of people from, say, 65 to 90, when it could take care of them from 0 to 20 as a much poorer society. In fact, the whole thing is just ridden with fraud. To the extent that there is a Social Security crisis, potentially, it's a reflection of a real fiscal crisis, namely health care. That's a major crisis, and it's growing. The U.S. has far and away the most inefficient healthcare system in the industrial world. Per capita costs are about 50% higher than the average for other industrial countries, and health outcomes are down at the bottom level. They're among the worst. Well, we know the reason. It's privatized. So there's a huge amount of administrative costs. There's layer after layer of bureaucracy, fill out all kind of forms, a ton of paperwork. The bills you get are impenetrable. You can't figure out what they mean. All of that adds up to huge costs. But there's no outcry over changing the healthcare system. There's a reason. Healthcare is basically rationed by wealth. So people toward the high income level get terrific healthcare, best in the world. Much of the population, in fact, a large percentage, just defer even necessary healthcare because they can't pay for it. Well, as long as the rich are making out, who cares? Furthermore, the system is designed to be very beneficial to insurance companies, pharmaceutical corporations, and so on. This immense wastage is profit for them. So there's no pressure for it except from the public. The public, in poll after poll, it's been going back years, considerable majority want to have some form of national health care system like every other industrial country does. But when that's even referred to in the press, it's called politically impossible, or lacking political support, meaning pharmaceutical industries opposed, the financial industries are opposed, and so on. I mean, just 2 days ago, General Motors broke its health care commitments to its former workers. They're not paying them, says can't pay them. Well, it's true that General Motors is in lousy financial shape, but the reason for that is the highly inefficient healthcare system, which means that corporations can't pay their promised share of healthcare benefits, which means it just goes right back to the taxpayer somehow. Well, that's a system, and that'll increase Social Security costs, because that includes Medicare. So yes, there's a crisis, but the crisis that does exist is not being addressed, though the public wants it to be. And the crisis that doesn't exist is being built up by a huge propaganda campaign, because the system is one that doesn't fit the principle that you described quite accurately. The guiding principle is enrich the rich and let the rest fare for themselves.
Linda, thank you for your call. Raymond in Milwaukee has been waiting. Hi, Raymond. You're on the air.
Good morning to you and your guest. I am convinced 9/11 was allowed to happen. Here's my thoughts, that Operation Able Danger and the Zacharias Moussaoui case, in both instances, the government said, we cannot pursue these investigations any further because these foreigners on our land are now protected by the same rights that American citizens would have. But if you read page 275 of the 9/11 report, specifically dealing with Moussaoui, the agent in Minneapolis, his cryptic memo to the Washington office or bureau of the FBI was, I believe this gentleman and his friends are going to crash planes into the World Trade Centers. 275 in the 9/11 report, and then the Able Danger report, which we got little bleeps of, but now for some reason has been swept back under the rug, proved that even Clinton knew something was afoot in this country with Mohammed Atta and these other gentlemen. They didn't even put their names on a watch list to prevent them from flying. So I am 100% convinced Bush might not have known exactly what was going to happen, but he knew something was going to happen, and they stood by and let it happen.
Well, by your logic, the same is true of Clinton. So what you're actually saying, and plenty of people believe this, is that the Bush and Clinton administrations just didn't care if there was a major terrorist attack in the United States. Well, that's possible, but we have much better evidence for it than this. I mean, this evidence, to tell you the truth, and that other evidence of that kind, claims about how the buildings fell down and so on, I don't frankly think they're very persuasive. I mean, the fact is that intelligence agencies, which are not super competent, as we know in the past, are flooded with information. Now, in retrospect, you can see which particles of that information were significant. But at the time, you can't. There's just too much. I mean, actually, the same thing occurs in the sciences. You're flooded with data, and you don't know what it means. Now, that's why scientists do experiments, to try to control an experiment just as an effort to control what you're looking at so that you'll get just the data that you guess is relevant. Well, you can't do experiments in human affairs. So what you have is, and it is even true of personal life, masses of data, like maybe your children someday have some kind of problem that you could have foreseen. Well, you could have foreseen it if you were omniscient, because the evidence was there, but hidden in masses of other evidence. And in retrospect, you can say, yeah, I see that was there. But that doesn't mean you let it happen. It just means that there's no way of telling. I honestly, and in fact, as for not caring whether terror occurs, we have far better evidence for it than this. Much better. I mean, take, say, the war in Iraq. The war in Iraq was undertaken with explicit warnings from intelligence agencies and other specialists, including CIA, that it was very likely to increase the threat of terror. Mm-hmm. And the post-war analyses by the CIA, and take a look at this morning's newspapers. Washington Post has an article by John Ward Anderson, good correspondent, saying that, reporting from France, that French intelligence, which has been following this probably more closely than maybe anyone, is now again reiterating that Iraq is becoming a major training ground for professional terrorists who will spread all over the world. The U.S., Israeli, Saudi, other intelligence agencies have drawn the same conclusion. I mean, whatever one thinks of Saddam Hussein, he was not involved in international terrorism. I mean, Saddam was a monster, but a secular monster. Osama is a monster, but a religious monster, and they hated each other. They were at opposite ends of the pole. Now, Iraq is not only involved in international terrorism, it's the center of it. And the people who were recruited for terrorism there were mostly, almost all, according to the intelligence agencies, recruited by the war. They had no past record of involvement and interest in terrorism. So it became a terrific recruiting agency. The French intelligence calls it a recruiting sergeant for terrorism, just as was EQing. Well, what that tells you is that there is an office of the Treasury Department, Office of Foreign Assets Control, which monitors suspicious funding transfers around the world. Well, that's a core part of the so-called war on terror. They came out with their records about a year ago. From the 1990 right up till the present, that's through the Clinton years, they were spending far more effort and energy tracing possible evasion of the U.S. embargo against Cuba, which is completely illegal. They were spending far more attention in that and much more penalties than on financial interactions involving Saddam Hussein or Al-Qaeda. Well, that tells you the priorities. So we know that terror is just not a high priority, and we don't need to, develop theories about 9/11, which don't have a lot of basis, in my opinion, in order to demonstrate that. There's much stronger evidence.
To remind listeners, we are talking with Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics and philosophy at MIT, author of many books, including Imperial Ambitions, Conversations on the Post-9/11 World. This book contains previously unpublished interviews conducted by radio journalist David Barsamian, in which Noam Chomsky talks about his views on the invasion and occupation of Iraq, the doctrine of preemptive strikes or preventive strikes, I guess Mr. Chomsky would say, and other issues. 1-800-642-1234 in Madison, 263-1890. I'm Joy Cardin. This is the Ideas Network. You're listening to the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio. I'm Joy Cardin. Ben Marins is with you this afternoon between 3 and 6, talking about current issues of the day. After 4, Ben will welcome in a guest to talk about the bird flu. And Kathleen Dunn, coming up after 9 o'clock, will be welcoming in William Crystal, editor of the Weekly Standard. We are talking with Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics and philosophy at MIT, and our next caller is Mike in Appleton. Hello, Mike.
Yes, good morning. Well, after listening to your guest for the last 45 minutes, one is inevitably depressed. Is there a bright side to anything? That's one question or comment.
Well, yeah, thanks for that. Is there anything positive to what's going on?
Very positive. For example, there is a huge gap in the United States between public opinion and public policy, and that's a hopeful sign, because one thing we can influence significantly is the state of American democracy. Dealing with, say, global warming or nuclear war, well, that's hard, but dealing with the serious decline of American democracy, that's something we can work on wherever we are, right at home. So, yeah, that's very hopeful. In fact, in my opinion, if you look at the public opinion polls and the attitudes of people on major issues, most of them are what I would at least support. So I feel myself kind of right in the mainstream of opinion, not policy, but opinion. That's hopeful because it means there's a great deal we can do, as in the past, to reconstruct a functioning democratic system in which public opinion matters.
Anything positive about Saddam Hussein going on trial starting today?
Well, that's an interesting... Look, Saddam Hussein's a major criminal. There's no doubt about it, and he's guilty of everything charged, I'm sure. But what's very striking about the trial today, very striking, and tells us about American democracy, is the crime for which he's being charged. The crime is killing of maybe 150 people in 1982. Well, 1982 has a very special role in U.S.-Iraqi relations. 1982 is the year when the Reagan administration dropped Iraq from the official list of states supporting terror, and did so that the U.S. could start providing Saddam with substantial aid. And that included technology that could be used for developing nuclear weapons, for bioweapons, and so on. And furthermore, that aid continued from 1982 right until practically the day of the invasion of Kuwait, long after, right through the worst atrocities that Saddam's accused of, after the war with Iran was over, so it didn't have to do with that. And in fact, the reasons were given officially by George Bush the first, to the responsibility to help American exporters, and because Saddam would help increase what's called stability in the Middle East, keep things quiet. Well, that's 1982. That's the year of the crime for which Saddam is going on trial. And that ought to be the front page headlines on every newspaper. Yeah, 1982, the year we started offering him massive support, continuing right through his crimes. Well, that tells us it's not that he's not guilty, but he's not the only one. And if we immunize ourselves from our own role and do that with 100% success, that's a very bad sign about this society.
Do you have thoughts, Professor Chomsky, on the investigation, the special prosecutor's investigation that's wrapping up as we speak into the leak of the identity of a CIA operative, Valerie Plame. We don't know if Karl Rove or Scooter Libby will be indicted or not, though there's speculation that's possible. What does this tell you about the press and the administration when it came to reporting during the lead up to the war in Iraq?
Well, the buildup of the war in Iraq was one of the more shameful periods of the press. In September 2002, the war was virtually announced. It began, that was the same month as the declaration of the national security strategy that the first caller brought up. The month began with Condoleezza Rice saying the next thing we'll hear from Saddam is a mushroom cloud and a huge drumbeat of government propaganda, all amplified by the media, which within a month had driven the population of the United States totally off the international spectrum. I mean, Saddam was hated everywhere, but he was feared only in the United States. The large majority of the population came to believe that Saddam was an imminent threat to the survival of the United States. He was tied up with 9/11, he was developing nuclear weapons, he's going to attack us, and so on. I mean, all of which was just outlandish. But it worked, and it continued. In fact, up till recent studies, large majority of the population says that the U.S. shouldn't have gone to war if Saddam didn't have weapons of mass destruction. Or, on the other hand, a large percentage, roughly half, think the war was right. Well, that looks like a contradiction because it's been conceded long ago that he didn't have weapons of mass destruction. But the point is that the government media propaganda campaign was so intense that it convinced people that he did and that he was involved in 9/11. He's tied up with Al-Qaeda, even though the facts are in front of them rejecting it. That's powerful propaganda. And the media have a large share in that. And that continues. If you read the reports today, the basic assumption of reporting is, how's our side doing? It's kind of like reporting the Wisconsin-Michigan football game or something. The reporting doesn't even pretend to be objective. It's how is our side doing? Do we have a strategy to win? Not should we be there? Not even a pretense of looking at it from a neutral point of view. That's not just the United States, incidentally. You listen to BBC, it's the same thing. And in fact, there's a sense in which you can't blame the press too much. The military catastrophe has been so extraordinary that the press just can't cover what's happening in Iraq. It's the first war that I can remember when reporters simply could not cover it. They're either locked up in the green zone, highly fortified zone in Baghdad, or else they can venture out, surrounded by Abrams tanks and so on. Most of the information that we're getting is coming from Iraqi stringers who risk their lives going out into this battle zone, which is much of the country, and a lot of them get killed. In fact, a fair number have been killed by American forces. The committees that protect journalists have been bitterly complaining about that. The result is you really don't know very much. But the point of view that's taken is just, we're obviously right, and therefore how well are we doing? And that's not reporting. Plus the instigation of fear among the population and the serious misimpressions has been astonishing. I mean, maybe not astonishing because it does happen all the time. The same was true in Vietnam and elsewhere, but very dangerous in this case.
We get another caller in, Dan in Partyville. Hi, Dan.
It's a pleasure to have you on, Mr. Chomsky. I got one question. In light of the fact that this Republican administration repeatedly lied to the American people to get us into an unjust and criminal war where tens of thousands have perished, Why were these incompetent buffoons able to get so many Americans to vote for them the second time around? I'll hang up and listen.
Well, the election of 2004 was a very revealing one. As I said before, critical information was just withheld from the public, not by the government, by the media, namely information about public attitudes and opinions. That's crucial in a democratic society, and that was just withheld. The election itself was about as meaningful as television ads. I mean, when you turn on television and you look at an ad for, toothpaste or cars or whatever it is, you don't expect to get information. That's not what ads are for. Ads are to delude you with imagery, and we all know that. The people who sell toothpaste and lifestyle drugs are the same people who run the elections. The elections are basically run by the PR industry, and their goal is not to provide information about the commodity they're selling, namely a candidate. Rather, it is to create imagery which will delude people. That's their vocation, and it's reasonably successful. So people had no idea what the stand of the candidates was. Roughly 10% of the voters knew where the candidates stood on issues. Now, just to give one example, take, say, the Kyoto Protocols, global warming and so on. The population is strongly in favor of supporting them. In fact, so strongly that a majority of Bush voters thought he was in favor of it, even though the administration was explicitly opposed. And that's true on issue after issue. People just don't know, because it's kept from them, not because they're stupid or not interested. And that tells you that the election was kind of like flipping a coin to pick a king. People were voting on the basis of delusionary imagery that was created consciously and keeping away from issues. And if you look at public attitudes, you can understand why both parties and the media want to keep away from issues. They just don't like public opinion. So therefore, let's keep issues off and turn on other things. Like, just to give one more example, if you read the business press, which is very revealing, the day after the election, they were describing what they called euphoria in boardrooms. I mean, was the euphoria because CEOs are opposed to gay marriage? I mean, they don't care one way or another. I probably favor it. What they recognized was what the public didn't realize and was prevented from realizing, namely that they were voting for an administration which was going to be super supportive of the rich, of business. So yeah, there was euphoria. But is that what people voted for? No. I mean, they voted, because there was imagery created which made Bush look like a kind of nice guy who, he'd like to have a drink with, who's talking to ordinary people and wants to go back to his ranch to, lasso cows or whatever he does on his fake ranch. And that's what people were voting for.
We have less than a minute to go, and I'm wondering if we can conclude with one public opinion poll we are seeing a lot, that nearly 60% of the U.S. population doesn't think we should be in Iraq and wants troops to be withdrawn as soon as possible, that this was a mistake. Will we get our wish?
It's up to us. I mean, these things don't happen by themselves any more than women's rights were won by a gift, or minority rights, civil rights, or freedom of speech, or any of the rights and privileges that we enjoy were won by struggle. They were not granted by gifts from above. And we can do that. We have this legacy of freedom that earlier struggles gave us. We can use it, or we can abandon it. And that'll be the answer to your question.
Yeah, and we'll leave it there. We're out of time. Thanks a lot for being with us.
Okay, thank you.
Noam Chomsky is a professor of linguistics and philosophy at MIT, author of numerous political works, including the latest, Imperial Ambitions, Conversations on the Post-9/11 World, published by Henry Holt. This book contains Previously unpublished interviews conducted by radio journalist David Barsamian with Noam Chomsky, in which Noam Chomsky talks about his views on the invasion and occupation of Iraq and many other issues. Thanks to Carmen Jackson for producing this program. Thanks to Cynthia Schuster for on-air production. Thank you for listening. I'm Joy Cardin. This is the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio.